if there was a little bit of focus on like new sets of data that could actually help the RBA in making those decisions, right? One of the things that's a problem with government data is a lot of government data is fueled and funneled through what is fundamentally surveys of different businesses, surveys of different consumers. But we give data away in literally everything we do today.
Today's episode of Socially Democratic is now available on Patreon. Join our Socially Democratic community for free or for as little as $2.50 a month, and you can help support the show so we can do more things like live shows and connect with fellow listeners across the country and help make this centre-left podcast the voice for social democrats in the face of a very hostile right-wing media. And when you sign up as a campaign organiser, there's different levels, and the top one is campaign organiser. You get a haters gonna hate swag, and the rest vote Labor. Haters gonna hate. Sorry, I should finish that off. A hater's gonna hate, and the rest vote Labor swag, like merch, stickers, and a calico bag and stuff. And you get access to all of our premium episodes and a free ticket to one of our live shows. And today I want to thank our latest members of our Patreon community: Brian Howlett, Monorail 29, old Marist alum there, Queen Bee from the NT, and Malcolm Scott. There's a couple of people there I actually know. That's wonderful. Thank you to those wonderful human beings for joining our Patreon community. And if you want to join, then follow the links in today's bio to become a member as well. Today's episode is also presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people that want to build power to make the world a better place, including community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses, and social democratic parties across the globe. We develop community engagement strategies to win campaigns both big and small, and we train engagement staff and volunteers in the Marshall Gantz framework of leadership, organising and action. And if you want to create change in your community, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Morris Blackburn Lawyers. As Australia's #1 plaintiff law firm, Morris Blackburn believe that the law should serve everyone and not just those who can afford it. They've helped influence some of Australia's most important legal decisions, including equal pay for women and Indigenous workers, and helped over 500,000 Australians get the compensation they deserve. Morris Blackburn, experience you can count on. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that drops every Friday, that dives into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking to Amit Singh from Mandala Partners. We've had Amit on the show before. He's basically our resident economist who's going to talk us through how the Australian economy is faring as we get closer to the federal election. So looking forward to that chat with Amit. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us reviews on all the various ways that you can give us reviews, or give us 5 stars on your Apple Pod app thing. And obviously don't forget to support the show by joining us on Patreon. And for everything else, follow us on Dunn Street, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn and Instagram. There you go. I did it in just under 3 minutes. And let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Thursday morning on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And it's been a while since I've had this bloke on the show to talk about economics. I always say there's like 8 really, really smart people in the Labor Party that know about economics, and this is one of them. And this is the only one that wants to come on the show as well, so I'm quite grateful. He's a former senior advisor to the Rudd government, Gillard government, then the Rudd government. So he's a stayer, and also worked for Bill Shorten, and he's now the managing partner at the economics advisory firm Mandala Partners. Amit Singh, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for the big compliment. I'm curious about who the others are, but we'll do that for another time.
We can break him down maybe. Let's well, actually, we're going to talk about economics because it's been a while since we've had you on the show. It's been a while since we've sort of kind of nerded out on economic policy and how the Australian economy is faring. There's an election coming up early next year. We know how important the economy is in terms of the conversation for voters and what's in the front of their minds. And so I guess in some ways I want to talk to you and find some hope for us leading into this critical federal election. But before we do, I called for the listeners and viewers on YouTube. I called up Amit yesterday just to quickly check in with him about today's episode. He said, "Hey, can you call me back once Obama's finished speaking? I'm just watching it right now." So obviously you've been watching a lot of the DNC, which is happening this week. Just give us some of your hot takes on what you've seen so far.
It's really funny because I've been thinking a lot about what James Carville said when after the debate, when everybody was really worried about Joe Biden's viability as the candidate, and basically Carville said Biden should go and they should have an open convention, and it should literally be so we let the whole of the Democratic Party have a pitch for it, and then the whole world will go, wait a second, these guys actually have a really deep bench. And actually, what was really great was that actually the Democratic Party has a really deep bench. You know what I mean? And so it's compelling television. Like yesterday, Obama was great. Obama was great, and yes, I did hang up on you on Obama, but I thought Pritzker was really good, right? Like, today I'm very excited about Shapiro. You know what I mean? Like, every day there's actually people, and what I think is really interesting is that they have actually skewed the agenda to do the old guys first, right? You know what I mean? And so, who would have thought that the Democratic Party is more than Clinton's, Obama's, and Biden's, right? But it actually is. And so, yeah, it's been really awesome.
It's been gripping television, and it's just such a contrast to how we felt moments into the debate that was in
Yeah.
early July. And the energy that is emanating from the Democratic Party at the moment is just, it's quite electrifying. Obviously, we'll have on the show next week, David Feeney will be back in to do the Feeney Files, our monthly recap. I feel like David's going to have lots of views of the DNC, so we'll have a massive unpacking of that. But I just wanted to get
I, I
your...
have I have a stake in this thing because my daughter is a biracial Indian girl that was born in a Bay Area Kaiser hospital, right? So, I mean, so for her, this is
There's a
like
connection.
there's a thing here, you know what I mean? So, yeah.
She's your Harris is her girl. I
Yeah.
mean, the other thing I'd sort of reflect on that is so refreshing that I always love about Democratic campaign communication that we just don't do enough about in Australia. We kind of think we do, but we don't. Is how narrative is central to how you're going to communicate to your audience. All of the speeches have had narrative laid through it, but some more than others and some to greater effect than others. Obviously, Obama, both Michelle and uh, Barack are great storytellers, but not this bullshit kind of missed understanding of what public narrative is, like a log cabin story, as we call it in Australia, which completely misses the point. But, explaining what you value in life through specific key story moments in your life that shape who you are. It's just all the way through, and hardly any policy. Like, honestly, tell me what the policies are of the Democratic Party right now going into an election that's only 85 days out. You wouldn't name any
Yeah.
of them. They're not even talking about them. It doesn't matter. And I know the electoral system's different because it's turnouts, voter registration, it's not persuasion like we have in Australia. But even still, like, we could do with a little bit more kind of story and a little bit more motivation and a little bit more hope and a little bit more uplifting of how we feel about our country. That was the biggest takeaway I got from the DNC, and we're only into like day 3.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. In fact, actually, that thing about narrative being central to communication, I think, is actually also a policy problem that we're having to deal with on inflation, right? And we'll get to it when we have the conversation. But I think the problem is that policy people look for a solution as like one solution. So cost of living is a problem, right? And the way we're trying to solve it is to find a magic bullet. And there is no magic bullet, right?
Mm-mm.
And so actually the way we can talk about the way we actually need to solve it from a policy point of view is the narrative about the components of inflation and what we're doing for those components of inflation, the ways in which we're trying to sort of address it. It actually doesn't just hurt us on the com side, it also hurts us on the policy side.
Yeah. Well, let's go there, shall we? I one day should get a podcast with some policy nerds and some comms people and just let them have at it and watch them rip themselves apart, because obviously they policy people
Yeah.
see the comms people tear apart their beautiful work, at the same time policy comms people look at policy and think that's why do I have to shit out 800 pages of this document to voters so they're going to only read the first 2 sentences. Can we just get a bit of an update of what your reflections are of how Labor is going and how the economy is going since Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, handed down the budget earlier in this year? It's now August. We had we had 2 episodes previewing and reviewing the budget with some folks from Macau and from Per Capita. We were worried about, how's Jim going to thread this needle of trying to, spend money to support people that are doing it tough whilst not making sure it was inflationary. It's now August. We've had a bit of time for the dust to settle. I just want to get your broader reflections on this budget that's been handed down and how is the economy sort of looking in this moment?
Yeah, I think at the time of the budget, it depended on whether you were in Sydney at the RBA or Canberra at the Treasury, because actually this was an interesting budget when Jim Chalmers handed it out, because there were actually kind of differing views, or at least there were differing views in the kind of official statements, right? The RBA thought the economy was going really hot. I mean, the Treasury thought the economy was a bit patchier, right? And so at the time, I think the budget, at the time, and I think it's still true today, the budget was reflecting basically a kind of view that the economy was a lot weaker than, I mean, had sort of appeared. And I probably share that view. I mean, I actually think that it's probably in a position that's kind of not as, it's got the sniffles, right? Like that doesn't mean it's anything we should be, overly concerned about, but I think it would be pretty naive to kind of, ignore the signals altogether. So I think at the time that the budget was framed, it was framed in that context. We need to deal with an economy that, has pretty low growth, and we need to make sure that we're giving it enough support through the kind of cycle. The RBA has a different view, right? And I think what's really interesting about the economy is that it is giving us very mixed signals. It's actually a hard job, right? GDP is down, unemployment is sort of starting to tick up a bit. Inflation is still very high compared to like where we want it to be. Wages are starting to go up, right? So actually, if you follow the commentary, if you follow the Twitter version of the economy, like we're following the commentary as the data's coming out, it's pretty confusing, right? But then if you strip it back and look at it, and that confusion then flows through in terms of the ways in which the different characterizations of the economy. So Jim Chalmers thinks the economy is barely growing. Michelle Bullock thinks the thing is basically, we need to be worried about. In her last press conference, she was even talking about the fact that hikes are not off the table, right? Which like honestly is pretty crazy, right? Like so when you kind of step back, like and you look at the headline numbers, the trend and the picture is much clearer, right? GDP is weakening, inflation is weakening, unemployment is starting to rise, and wages seem to have kind of peaked. Like they've risen, but they sort of seem to have peaked. And so this actually is a design feature of how the economy is supposed to work, right? Like this is meant to be, we're getting through a cycle in which inflation and everything had been pushed up higher by energy price shocks. In the global economy, the hangover from COVID, which had a bunch of different supply chain constraints, and basically, a bunch of pressures caused by US domestic policy affecting the rest of the global economy. Those things have kind of ended up sort of affecting like what should happen. And so what our economy was doing was actually doing, what people have sometimes referred to as a kind of soft landing, right? The challenge though is how do you get that seesaw right? You want to make sure the economy is weak enough to cool inflation, but you don't want to kill the patient, right? Because you don't want it to get into a kind of a recessionary cycle, right? And so it's actually pretty hard, right? If you do more big spending, you push it in the direction of kind of high inflation. If you don't, if you leave rates high for too long, you push people to the wall and basically then sort of cause kind of, cause effectively a recession, right? And so one of the things that's kind of really difficult, and then what are the different swing factors that are in there in the middle, and how do our politics affect the swing factors, right? Immigration has been a big part of the story of like protecting us from a recession, right? If we actually took out if we took out immigration, right, it's the only thing that's been standing between Australia and a recession for about 5 quarters now. So like the idea that immigration is kind of something we need to be dealing with is like, other than the fact that it's like economically boneheaded, it actually doesn't make any sense, right? And you can kind of see this in like small parts of the immigration debate, right? This discussion around the cap on international students, right, is a microeconomic policy that has a macro effect. If you kind of have that, like that's like, you should worry about that, those types of things. So I actually think it's a very, the economy is in reasonable shape, but it has a kind of challenging short-term period. And I think that's the bit that we're sort of trying to go through. The real big surprises are actually overseas.
Do you want to go there? Because I was going to follow up and ask you more about the RBA and their kind of response to dealing with this. Because there's a couple of things you said that I find interesting. The first one is this tension that exists between the Treasury and the RBA. Is that his? I mean, is that a rare thing to see these two organisations out of kilter with one another on economic policy?
I don't think it's a rare thing to see. In fact, if things work well, they should offer a counterpoint to each other, right? And so I actually don't think it's a rare thing. I also think it's probably not fair to kind of describe it as it's probably not fair to describe them as them being in conflict with each other. It's just that they have a slightly different perspective. They are structures that force them to kind of end up working together on a bunch of things. Like they have a joint economic forecasting group. The Secretary of the Treasury sits on the RBA board. So there are ways in which but it is clear, like, to people on the outside, it's clear that there is a difference of kind of view. And I think that, and I think the challenge in that view is that the RBA has to make these decisions every month, right, about interest rates. And the RBA has kind of had a habit. I don't think it's a good habit, but they've had a habit in the last few years of trying to. So it's really important for RBA to give certainty to markets, because markets then make judgments about where interest rates are going to go and make decisions, as a result of it. They can make those judgments based on the kind of, pronunciations of the RBA. I think one of the challenges is that, for one reason or the other, the RBA is sort of given forward guidance a lot, and that forward guidance has kind of ended up, in a sense, kind of, they feel committed to their words rather than actually looking at the data that's kind of in front of them.
Okay, why don't we talk about what's going on around the world first of all before we come back home and then start to throw rocks at the RBA? What were your thoughts about what's happening globally, so we can get us understanding of where Australia's position is within the global economy?
Yeah, so I kind of described this sort of seesaw that we're trying to sort of balance. Where one way you could have, like, you can end up with a prolonged period of high inflation, which would be really bad for people because it'll make things a lot, very expensive. Or the other way is you could end up basically causing effectively an inflation, causing effectively a recession, which is really bad for a whole bunch of people for for similar reasons. But, like, the question is it harder for you if everything is really expensive and you can't afford it? Or is it harder for you if you don't have a job, right? And, neither is a good position to be in. The interesting thing about it is that we kind of seeing two signals overseas as well, right? We've started to see countries start to cut interest rates. So the EU and Canada have started to kind of cut interest rates. Japan has actually weirdly hiked. Not weirdly, it's actually kind of consistent with what they should have been doing, right? So there's kind of this whole thing where it sort of seems like central banks overseas that Australia look to are kind of starting to starting to sort of cut. There's also a lot of pressure in the US that the Federal Reserve needs to start moving, reasonably soon. And so when you have those cuts overseas, what it does is it basically strengthens the Australian dollar, which effectively then reduces inflation in Australia because it reduces the demand for our exports and pushes down prices. The other kind of shock on the other side is basically, Trump, right? Um, and really the kind of key factor there is, and I know that, like, a few weeks ago, like, it's kind of wild to think about this year where basically a month ago that was the central case, right? But like, Trump's move, Trump has promised to do massive new trade tariffs against China. This is he's said this beyond, like, Project 2025. Like, this is, like, not a theory. This is like, so he wants to do massive new trade. He wants to basically start a kind of trade war, right? With the rest of the world. But what that will do is it'll push up the prices of everything, right? And that then means we start to import a whole bunch of inflation into Australia, right? So, another way to kind of think about it is that tariffs are, in a way, a tax on our own citizens, right? So as you start to increase, as he increases tariffs, we have to do those. That means that we kind of end up pushing up prices. The Fed Reserve raises interest rates, it weakens the Australian dollar. We push up the price of everything. More stuff has to leave the country, and you end up basically very quickly in a high inflation cycle, right? So the most important thing to the cost of living of Australians is actually the election of a Democratic president. But but I think but that jokes aside, it's actually a difficult balancing act. The difficult balancing act in Australia, and the global economy is actually kind of really finely balanced, right, in terms of what happens.
I mean, no, I mean, I know you're being mildly flippant there, but I mean, it's so true. Like, people always say to me, Stephen, why do you care about American politics so much? Why do why are you so invested in that country? And that normally comes out of the mouths of people who are sort of basically anti-American anyway. But I have to, I just say to them, like, when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. Like, if they're doing well,
Yeah,
we're doing well, and if they're not doing well, then we're in a
exactly.
spot of bother, both economically and also socially and culturally and all the other things as well. What they're wearing on the streets of New York last September, we'll be wearing them in 3 or 4 years' time. So let's come home and talk about the RBA. Bill Shorten, our former illustrious leader, now the minister. He's got a what did he get in the portfolio reshuffle? He's sort of got an economic portfolio now, hasn't he? I can't remember what it was.
Is the minister for the NDIS and the minister for government services, which is
Government services.
basically the digital stuff. Yeah.
Yep. He said in last week he had a crack at the RBA, saying the RBA is independent, but that doesn't mean that they're immune from being disagreed with. He said, I do not believe the economy is running hot for most Australians. There are some Australians who are doing very well, but for most Australians, we're seeing their savings being reduced. We're seeing their cost of living pressures. The way to deal with it, though, isn't to push this nation into recession with higher and higher interest rates. And then started a broader conversation in the media and the commentariat about what exactly is the role of the RBA. And it's something that even though I am just a punter when it comes to this sort of stuff, and that's why I get people like you on the show, Amit, because I look at the RBA and think, you're like that football coach that still thinks that long ball is the strategy to win games. And you've been doing it since the 1970s and you don't know any other strategy and you just keep doing that. Now, maybe that's the only thing that they've got going for them or the only thing that they can do. But I just feel like every time we get into this situation where the economy's running a bit hot, they're like, well, just jack up interest rates. Away we go again. Like, where is the intellectual creativity from these morons? Like, there's about 500 people working in that building. What are they all doing all day sitting around? Like, that month thing's coming up again where we've got to make a decision about interest rates. And I reckon Damien gets out a coin and just flips it and goes heads or tails, tails up, heads down. Like, it's got to be a bit more sophisticated than that because people are hurting out there. And I just think that this sort of silver bullet solution that's coming from the RBA is out of sync and out of touch with how folks are feeling in Main Street.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there to unpack. The first thing to say, I mean, just because I need to protect my things, is the RBA is independent and they do a great job, right? Like and relatively speaking, compared to like central banks around the world, they actually do a really good job. There was a review of the RBA that was done by a bunch of pretty smart people, and it kind of came back with a bunch of recommendations on what to do, and they've started implementing some of those things. One of those things was to get was to improve their communications with the Australian public so people could kind of understand how they were doing and what they were thinking about different things. You know what I mean? And so I think as an innovation, it was a good innovation, right? I do worry a bit about the RBA being a bit like, I couldn't find the right analogy when I was thinking about this morning, where anything you do to kind of question the RBA then becomes like, I mean, a symbol of like, some kind of like, breaking some kind of economic, like, like almost as if they were like a sacred cow, a sacred Washington monument that you couldn't possibly touch. You know what I mean? Because you say something that disagrees with them, right? You know what I mean? I do
If it was
think that the
Seinfeld, it'd be like the delicate genius. You can't pick on the delicate
yeah,
genius.
yeah, right. And so I think there's like a really reasonable question for people to ask, which is, look, the economy, like people are feeling a lot of pain in the economy, right? The RBA does have, like the RBA is a public institution, right? We impose today a whole bunch of social responsibilities on private corporations, right? Like, we literally like, despite actually delivering reasonably, I mean, decent, and I know I'm like, I mean, out on like a, I mean, out on the kind of periphery of this debate, right? But sorry, I'm out on my own here in an island just probably occupied by three people. But I actually thought Brad Banducci was a good CEO of Woolworths, right? You know what I mean? And so, and you know what I mean? And there is a social responsibility in being the CEO of Woolworths, right? There just somehow weirdly doesn't seem to be a social responsibility on being the governor of the Reserve Bank, right? Which is paid for by us,
Yeah.
right? Which is paid for by us. Now, I get it. Like I get that they've got to make decisions that are, reflective of what they see and the kind of data that they have. But the truth is, interest rates actually matter to the cost of living of many Australians, right? Like we cannot underestimate the importance of housing to the Australian economic story and to our living standards, right? Like, I'm happy to kind of go more into like why I think that's important, but I think on the kind of question of the RBA things, I think the economy is weaker. You know what I mean? I think, I live in Richmond. I have my own Bridge Road Index, which is basically how many shops have closed on Bridge Road, and there are lots of shops that are closing on
Yeah.
Bridge Road, right? And I think that there's probably I think there's probably like a little bit, just a little bit more kind of understanding of what's going on would help. I think if we push through the reforms that were called for by the RBA review, that would also help, which seemed to be kind of a little bit delayed. And I also think that if there was a little bit of focus on like new sets of data that could actually help the RBA in making those decisions, right? One of the things that's a problem with government data is a lot of government data is fueled and funneled through what is fundamentally surveys of different businesses, surveys of different consumers. But we give data away in literally everything we do today. So you can actually get that data through observed patterns of behavior, right? You should be able to work out how small businesses are going because every small business does their accounting online, right? You should be able to work out what people are spending money on because everyone is buying things in literally two supermarkets. You know what I mean? Like there is ways in which we can kind of be a bit better on the kind of data question as well. I'm sure that they're doing the best. This is not to say they're not doing the best job, but I just sort of feel like, the way in which they have tried to approach this, almost in a way in which they're lecturing the rest of us to say your cost of living pressures are not real, I think is actually not. Like I don't think like that rankles with me a bit because I think the
That,
cost of living problem is actually serious.
that's an interesting point you make there, I mean, because I think there's the same challenge in the United States as well, because obviously a lot of the economic indicators in the US in the last 12 months under the Biden administration have suggested that the American economy is in good shape
Yeah.
and that they are getting on top of inflation. But from what I've read is that the way that they measure inflation isn't reflecting on the things that consumers are actually feeling the pinch on. That is, that there are
Yeah.
certain, I'm going to make it up, I can't remember, but like gas prices isn't in the inflation index. That
That's
might
good.
not be
Yeah.
true, but it's things like that aren't in there. And so folks are going, yeah, okay, the inflation number might be now 4, but in my own life, things are still really, really expensive. And so therefore the data they're collecting isn't actually reflective of what consumers are buying. Is that what's
Yes.
happening here in Australia as well?
Well, that is some part of that answer. Yeah, that's right. I mean, like they are different things that are the way in which we think about the basket. Now, David Gruen, who's the chief statistician, has done a pretty good job on trying to update, the way in which the ABS calculates inflation and the kind of measures that it looks at, right? But there are always challenges in the ways in which you kind of collect data on these kinds of questions. I mean, do you do it quick enough? Do you do it, do you do it with enough frequency? Are you looking at the right things? Does it really reflect the kind of experience of most people, right? Like I think one of the challenges in making these decisions is that interest rates is one big broad brush decision that affects everyone, right? But there's actually different parts of cities that have different pressures and the ways in which they deal with it, right? Like, if you continued along Bridge Road into Burwood Road and into Hawthorne, you'd probably have a different measure. Do you know what I mean? Like, and
Yeah,
so
that's
and
interesting.
so that so that's also part of the problem. Like we're using, one big sledgehammer across the whole thing. The only problem is that this sledgehammer is actually really important, right? Like the problem with interest rates is that actually our entire economic system is basically designed around home ownership, right? Like we have double the amount of like housing equity contributes about double the amount of household wealth in Australia compared to the US and the UK, right? Like we have made conscious choices about why, and this, I actually think this is a great part about like the Australian economic story. We've made conscious choices about giving individuals the ability to access and own home ownership rather than corporations or big asset owning groups, right? Like which is what caused the kind of GFC in the US, right? Like we have actually given individuals that chance to kind of get onto the income ladder and to support like labor, to support sort of social mobility in Australia. The problem with it is that because we've given people these particular things, we probably need to care a lot about the policy settings that get that right. You know what I mean? Owning a home is the largest component of Australian wealth, right? It contributes to like a lot of things that are important to the way in which you think about well-being, like lower rates of psychological distress, you're more likely to be employed, you get better retirement outcomes, you're more likely to trust institutions, you're more likely to be engaged civically. You will be civically engaged if your interest rates are going to know, always going to be changing, right? So like the problem is like we have an economic system that's built around this kind of concept of like home ownership, right? The only problem with it is that actually as time has passed, that's become even more challenging for Australians, right? And the worst part about it is that every generation that comes, it's even harder for the next generation to get it because we've put in a whole bunch of policy settings to basically lock in that thing, right? Like this was meant to be the miracle tool that we were going to use to basically, provide prosperity for all Australians. It's just that a bunch of people got it and then shut the door on the way in. Yeah.
In that they not only own their own home, but they own several others. Is that where you're sort of
That's
going?
right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. So like, the way in which it was meant to work was that, you were meant to have, there's nothing wrong with owning multiple investment properties and other things, right? Like the problem with it is that the way we built our economic system, like the beauty, like it's actually like when you think of if you take it back, it's actually brilliant, right? There's like what we're going to do is create a society that basically says, the way we're going to store people's wealth is store them by effectively allowing them to buy their home, create settings that allow them to buy, to have home ownership. Like, for example, like we take offset accounts for granted in Australia. It's an Australian only thing. It doesn't exist other
Mm.
places, right? You know what I mean? Like we provide we provide like different forms of cover in the way in which we think about like access to finance, the way we think about planning, the way we built our cities, right? All of it is catered towards effectively giving people an opportunity. We have a high minimum wage, right? All of it is catered towards giving opportunities for Australians to own their own home and use that as the anchor point for household wealth, which then becomes important for their kind of labor mobility and their growth, right? That's why we care about interest rates, right? Like the only problem with it is that as time has passed, that disposable income has now become a really big part of housing costs, right? Whether you own or rent, right? The ability to kind of, if you're a renter to become an owner is harder than it was ever before. Like the last decade saw Australian incomes grow at the slowest rate that they've grown in the entire history of Australia, right? So you basically made it harder to get housing, you made it harder to get kind of income growth, right? There aren't enough new houses being built, right? Like, we're about a 1.5 million new homes kind of short, to maintain the current levels of kind of where we need to go. And there are a whole bunch of pressures on affordability from the ways in which we think about the way in which we build houses. Like, for example, like we don't use a lot of insulation in the building of our houses. So our houses aren't super efficient in terms of the total costs of what they do, right? So it's like, that's why I think when people kind of say, oh, well, interest rates is only one thing, it's like, if you really wanted to tackle, like, this is the hard part about our politics, right? We're trying to do a whole bunch of things because we can't say anything to, the genius delegate, right? You know what I mean? And the problem with it is that actually it means that we aren't really addressing the fundamental cost of living pressures, right? Which, exist in housing, exist in health, exist in groceries, consumer goods, and insurance, right? We can't tackle the main one, which is on housing, right? Unless we do something about this kind of interest rates question.
If we did have a government that was courageous, and I'd say that I'm not saying that in an asinine way to pick on our current government. I'm not suggesting they're not courageous, but if maybe I am, I don't know. But if you had a magic wand, perhaps, what are the first couple of things that you would do to actually tackle that? Because the thing I'm finding interesting in what you're saying is, this Australian dream. It's such a great the social mobility we talk about Australians
Inefficient. Yeah.
having the ability to own your own home, right? But that sentence is misleading because you're saying the ability to own your own home. The dream wasn't to own your own home and 5 other investment properties. That's not how it was sold, but that's what people have done. Only in Australia do we refer to housing as property. Well, I want to say only in Australia,
Yeah.
certainly in the English-speaking world. When I go and visit family in Scotland and stuff, they don't refer to this is my property. They go, this is my home. That's
Yeah.
my home and I own it. I worked hard and I bought it off, and the bank doesn't own it. I'm very proud about that. Whereas in Australia, I go, that's one of my properties. There's another one of my properties. I've got properties everywhere, right? And I just trying to mentally break that from you can't go out to Australians and say, hey, enough of the properties, all right? Our goal is for you to own one. If you own one, then mazel tov, congratulations. Let's just stop there. You can't do that, right? But if we did do something like that, and this sounds very, very communist, and I don't agree with this at all, but how can we stop people buying lots of properties and just trying to work out getting one? And then all of a sudden, you might start to solve that problem of that 1.4 million that you're talking about in terms of shortages. I just sort of trying to work out, like, do you do a sunset clause going, enough of the properties from now on, just the one, all right? Can we just share this a bit more equilibrially? Talk me through about some of the ways we can solve this, Amit.
I'm broke. Like I don't know. I think I feel like I'm a broken tape recorder for anyone that's anyone that talks to me about it. Right? We're the only country in the world that has anything that looks like negative gearing. Right? Like we're the only country in the world that gives a 50% discount on capital gains that are associated with like property. Property sales. Right? Like it's just like it it kind of ends up being like we do not have policy settings that are in line with literally anybody else that we would consider a peer society, right? Like it is genuinely the most galling thing that we've got, right? I think the thing that we've got to what are ways in which you could solve it? There are more than enough credible policies and the ways in which you could kind of result in managing these situations, right? Like I think the change to increase the capital gains discount was only made during the Howard years. It is not a fundamental part of who we are as Australians, right? Like it was
That's a good
kind of
point.
done as a policy change. This wasn't at the formation of the country, right? Like people make it sound like when we decided to come together as a federation, we decided to give everyone a 50% discount on capital gains.
Mm.
Associated with the housing. Um, negative gearing, there's a bunch of like negative gearing is a legitimate tool that people should use to be able to improve their kind of wealth, right? But it doesn't need to be done for 9 houses as they are for some members of our parliament, right? It can actually be curtailed. Like I think you can just limit it. You can limit it to like 2 properties if you want. Take a number that's like less than 9, right? Like
Yeah.
pick any number less than 9, right? Like you can do it where you can kind of sunset it, where you can basically use it, but you can also use it to stimulate investment in new property, right? Like, so one of the things that some of the smart guys at McKell had done, and then some of the things that had been like for a period of time Labor Party policy was to say you could only do negative gearing on new properties, on new investment properties. So basically use it as a part of thing to drive the kind of investment in kind of new dwellings. I think that actually the problem with it is that whenever we've never given the choice of Australians to vote just on housing policy. It's always mixed up with a whole bunch of other things, and so you don't really have a clear signal on whether or not that actually affected the outcome of an election. But no doubt, every time it happens, people then say, "Oh, we can't touch housing policy because it's too hard."
Yeah.
I actually
Yeah.
think not touching housing policy is actually the thing that has caused the diminution of our trust in institutions, and more importantly, the growth of the non-major party vote.
Do we want to, I mean, without turning this into a housing podcast, I want to get a sense from you about the structure of the Australian economy.
Yeah,
And certainly since COVID, like you and I distinctly remember this conversation that you and I had on the last episode when you came on the show. We were talking about what we learned from the 1990s recession, in which a number of workers of a certain age and skill, in their later years, dropped out of the economy. And so we all looked at
yeah.
these people and thought, "Fuck, this is tragic. This is a tragic story of what happens when an economy goes into recession." But at the same time, you said it also then brought in a whole new group of workers that reshaped the economy, that were younger workers. And we were talking about that in the context of we're in COVID right now, and the economy is obviously going through a lot of stresses. and you're reflecting on it, well, I wonder what the economy will look like when we come out of this. There will be some bad news stories, but there'll also be some good news stories. And I just want to get a sense from you about how is the Australian economy in this post-COVID era restructured? Like, obviously, there's a lot of folks working from home now. We're just seeing that. Like, I live right in the heart of Melbourne's central business district, and Monday and Friday, it's quiet in terms of foot traffic. Like, you can just sense that. Whereas in the middle of the week, it's a lot busier. A lot more people are self-employed. More people are getting subcontracted, even particularly in trades. Like, no one's working. No one does an apprenticeship and then works for, their boss as a plumber or painter for the rest of their lives. They end up becoming a subby and doing subcontracts as a part of a program, right? So what's happening in terms of the way that the economy is changing here in Australia, and maybe even globally as well, but certainly in Australia, and what does that then mean in terms of how do we adjust to those things? And maybe we'll have a conversation more about tech in a moment, but just give us a sense of it. Has the economy changed much since COVID structurally?
I think I think I think the answer to that question is that actually COVID for I think a lot about the kind of conversations we had around that time as well. I think we sort of thought that COVID was going to be a more disruptive economic kind of event than it actually ended up turning out to be, right? I mean, it was a disruptive event for a lot of people, and it continues to have big implications for certain industries. And as you said, it's changed the way in which we think about cities. In terms of the structure of our economy, actually, the things that it did was like the strengths of our economy continue to be strong, even through the pandemic, right? Like I think what actually happened was it probably reinforced our strength in resources, right? Because we had a stable supply of continuing resources that continued to basically be available. And actually, what it did was it actually, pushed back the coming offline of like other newer kind of resource competitors to us, right? I mean, as a country, right? I think it made one of the big kind of challenges in our economy is the nature of the fact that we don't have a very large population for what is actually a pretty advanced economy, right? And so as a result, what it did was it concentrated a little bit of power in like existing institutions, right? I mean, so it concentrated power, not institutions, existing corporations, right? I mean, so one of the kind of downsides of like the post-COVID thing is actually competition lessened a lot. Competition in airlines is probably the best place where that's kind of happened. I mean, where actually you kind of ended up losing a bunch of, supposed like alternatives, right? So I think that's like one kind of feature of it. But one thing I think that's kind of important to remember is that actually a lot of other kind of, another kind of feature of like the post-COVID thing is that we also forgot how consumers like interact with the economy, right? And I think that's actually been to me or like one of the biggest kind of outtakes is that actually, and it's related a little bit to the kind of inflation conversation as well, right? Is that we're seeing a lot of kind of cost pressures in the economy because we've got a kind of supply side of the economy that is catered to a very different demand side of the economy, right? So the ways in which we think about, one of the most persistent levels of like, rises in inflation have been in health services. But that's partly because we still have these big box hospitals that are meant to do all these other things when people don't have time to go and do elective surgery. They've either given up on it or aren't going to spend whole days doing like day surgeries, paying surgeons to get another Lambo, right? Like actually people have got other ways to kind of deal with it, right? So like the demand for health services has changed like quite a lot, but we still have the supply side that hasn't responded to that change, right? Education is another example, right? Like we've seen the kind of rise of things like generative AI and other things like that, right? They affect actually uni degrees, right? They don't affect like vocational education, people wanting to learn new skills and transition. You think about even things that are really well established, like financial services. Some people will think that banks haven't changed, right? Actually, what COVID did was it gave a massive rise to like digital banking, like in a sense, right? Where you can kind of get a home loan now without actually ever going into a bank branch, right? Like, and I think, and I think the big banks kind of did really well in it, but also I actually kind of find this whole discussion about the big four a bit like cute because actually there's a big five, right? Like Macquarie's growth has basically meant that it is actually now, it's cut out of a lot of the kind of regulatory conversations, but it is basically a pretty strong kind of, like contender in that kind of system, right? Like it's not as big as, that we never really had equal sizes. Like the big four is actually the difference between the biggest and the smallest of the big fours is a half, right? Like, yeah, so that's not like, that's like saying that there's like big four political parties in America and we're going to count the Greens, right? You know, what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think you've got to, so I think there've been like a lot of changes in the ways in which we think about consumer things. So that's kind of, I'd say, at the kind of headline level of the economy. There's probably, but I think the thing we've got to forget, or the thing we've got to remember is that we did relatively well compared to other economies. And we still, and we kind of emerged out of this with like the second highest median wealth per adult and one of the highest living standards in the world, right? A way in which I'd like to do it to basically rib my British friends is that in the year 2000, Australia was a quarter of the size of the UK economy, and today it's half the size of the UK economy, right? Like it's conceivable in our lifetime that we will be like on par with them, right? Like, or close enough to like being on par with them before we basically die.
Which is huge. How much is that to do with Brexit, though, do you think, and the decisions that they've made at a local level?
Oh, I think it's a combination of the decisions that they've made and a combination of decisions that we've made, right? Like, I think
Yep.
we have a pretty dynamic and flexible economy. Like the problem with it is it's not very productive or very efficient. You know what I mean? Now there's actually a reasonable explanation for it. It's not an excuse; it's an explanation. Um, but the reason we've got this is partly because the strengths that we've got make us, make us good at some things, but it means that we've got to focus our effort on being good at those things rather than actually being good at a lot of things, right? Now, that's why I think that's what makes a lot of people anxious, but I don't think it should be something we should be totally worried about, right? Like I find, you often hear this argument that's used by a lot of labor and kind of a lot of labor and a lot of center left kind of economists about the complexity of the Australian economy. Australia having like one of the least complex economies in the world, right? I actually hate that argument, right? Like because any other country in the world that would have the kind of strength of like, some sectors that are globally competitive at a scale that is like, unprecedented in like economic history would do exactly the same thing, right? Like, we shouldn't be trying to make our economy more complex by being poorer.
Mm.
We should just be focused on making our economy more productive and more efficient, right? We don't have to have, yes, I think we should be smart about building up future sectors of the economy. And I think that's why I think Future Made in Australia is actually really clever from the government, right? But I also think that this idea that we need to make the economy more complex is like it can only be done by making us poorer, right? You know what I mean? We are very good at mining because we're very good at mining because we have something that the world needs and nobody else has, right? And so we should use that in a way that is efficient, that's productive, that doesn't waste the kind of resource, that makes clever and smart decisions about them, that then, uses technology to kind of get up that curve. We have a health system that is, we have a health system that is enviable in the world, notwithstanding the pressures that we have at the moment on workforce. We should export that talent. We should export that quality. We should use it in other parts of the world, right? The largest private hospital provider in France is an Australian listed company, right? Like we should take that, things. We have an education system that, has a genuine export market where the only competitors are the only competitors are Canada, the UK, US, and Ireland, right? And we should protect that, right? Like we should think of it as a kind of export market that can actually be utilized, not use it as a cudgel every time we need to have a debate, some asinine debate about migration.
Mm. The Actually, no, I won't get there because we're going to run out of time. Maybe it's for another episode. Because I want to go to the mining tax. Actually, no, let's do that. Your reflections on the mining tax or some kind of tax on the royalties of the dirt that we're digging up. Like when you think about trying to create efficiencies in mining, is it inefficient for us to dig up dirt and then just ship it overseas and give it to the Chinese, who then takes that dirt and then turns it into steel and then we buy it back?
Um, I think that's an oversimplification of actually, what happens, right?
I'm a
Like I
simple man,
think
Amit.
that I think that I think it's better to think about it less in the context of that because actually the conversion of like steel and other things would be harder to do for us to be able to get the value add from it, right? Like actually our East Asian model kind of works reasonable. Our East Asian trade model works reasonably well. There's a whole separate discussion about why that doesn't work in South Asia and why it won't work for our India strategy, but we'll leave that, as it is. The thing I think we should think about though is it's better to think about this in the context of critical minerals rather than to think about it in terms of iron and steel. And I think this is an actual problem, right? So in critical minerals, what we've got is that we say that we shouldn't be involved, like the economic orthodoxy, or well, not the economic orthodoxy. Some people will say we should not get involved in any part of the critical mineral supply chain because we can't do end-to-end battery production in Australia. That's true. We can't do end-to-end battery production in Australia. But we have one of the largest stores of lithium in the world, right? We have, 70% of any Tesla that you drive involves Australian lithium, Australian iron, or Australian copper, right? Australian nickel, iron, or Australian lithium, right? Like Australian lithium is actually a pretty important ingredient in building the battery supply chain. The thing is, you don't have to do there's 5 steps you need to take to get from lithium to a fully functional battery. We don't have to do all 5 steps. We can do the second one or the third one, right? We can leave the other ones to other parts of the world that are more efficient on being able to do that. And that's the bit that I think, we need to kind of be focused on. Like that's what the government in the budget had, this thing called the production tax incentive. It was a response to a thing that was in Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which was a big kind of industry policy kind of effort in the US. I think that Australia would have had a cost advantage, if not for the IRA, in being able to turn lithium into spodumene and also into concentrate, which gets you kind of the value added activity and the types of jobs that would come from that, right? And I think that's how we should be thinking about the kind of supply chain on minerals and the ways in which we can kind of use those, right? I think critical minerals are going to be really important to they're going to be really important to 2 important big trends, right? They're going to be really important to the energy transition, but they're also going to be really important to the tech transition because the tech transition will need the energy to be able to use that, right? Like so, the tech transition, if you think about data and AI and all the other things, needs electricity to make that work. The electricity to make that work has to come at some level from new energy. The new energy that needs to come has to come from the minerals that are basically mined here. But what we need to make sure is that we're not missing out on different parts of the supply chain as a result of that.
That's an excellent segue, Amit, into my question about AI. And it's something that I've really not paid attention to at all, apart from maybe jumping on ChatGPT every now and then to try to, use it to pull together some surveys and give me the top 5 responses of 1,000 people who've written a survey. There are. I just want to get your reflection on that because I don't know if ever there's some group that's saying that we'll never have to leave our houses again because AI will take all of our jobs, and then there's other people who are still thinking that this isn't going to have any impact at all. Where are you on this one? What are your reflections on AI and how it can impact the businesses in the future?
I think I think technology is a really important part of how we are able to get the productivity that we need to kind of continue to maintain living standards. So you need to be productive because you need to do more, get more with less, right? Getting more with less means we can get more income. Getting more income means we can get more living standards. Getting more living standards means that the RBA can steal more money by having interest rates as high at a higher level. Now, there's a joke at the end, but the point is, we kind of need technology to get the productivity increases that we want, right? The way we get the way we get that technology is actually if it's boring, right? So what I think is really hard about, so I think the AI, where do I sit on the AI debate is probably on neither side of that, right? Like there is a hype cycle and there's a doom cycle, and both of those things are a danger to our productivity, right? On the hype cycle side, we've had some CEOs of major companies talk about it as being, just as profound as fire. It's like, no, mate, it's not. Like AI is important. It's not as profound as fire, right? Like it did not give, humanity the ability to civilize. Like it will be important, but it won't be that important. And then you have the doom cycles that are worried about like killer robots and like, automated decision making and all the other shit, right? Like,
Terminator 2 has a lot to answer for in that.
yeah. The truth is, like, generative AI will be useful a bit, but it's not the main part that will be useful. Where AI is going to be useful is where the rest of the economy is at and where we're good at in the rest of the economy. So we use a lot of AI and we use a lot of technology in mining. That's because we're good at mining, not because we're good at AI, right? Like, you know what I mean? We use a lot of, we actually are, you know what I mean, have one of the most sophisticated, digitally enhanced, like, financial services sectors in the world, right? Like, we had, we had tap pay before most of the places had, right? Like, we
It's
do
true.
pretty well. Do pretty well on financial. Well, that's because we've got a strong financial services sector, not because we are great at AI and have kind of put it there. Right now, we become good at it on the applications. We become good at AI by applying it to, like, different sectors. Like, we're actually pretty. I mean, we use AI in construction reasonably well compared to other places because we have a reasonably good construction sector, right?
Mm.
And so I think the main thing is to have the Australian accent on the way in which we think about the AI debate. What's Australia really good at? Australia's really good at adopting technology very quickly. It's really good at including everyone in that adoption. It means that you don't have the haves and the have-nots on technology. Actually, you know what I mean? Like, the National Broadband Network was a really, really important part about making that equivalent to, like, the whole of the country, right? And we're really good at innovating as a result of those kinds of new technologies, right? Like, as the ways in which we work evolve, how do we kind of change that to the ways in which we think about the ways in which we work? So, I think on the AI debate, I'm like, I'm genuinely worried that we're going to end up, like, the debate is going to swallow the problem rather than actually letting us, like, find the usefulness that we can over the course of, like, the rest of the things. Like, there's this great quote that someone once used that said, "I want AI to be able to do my laundry and my dishes, not for, so that I can read and paint." Rather than, AI to do the reading and painting, so I have to do laundries and dishes, right? AI
Mm.
can be a super useful tool for us in the ways in which we think about things in the future. And I think it will be a really important productivity uplift, but only if we're able to adopt it across the whole economy, only if we're able to include all people in it, and only if we're able to find, like, small innovations, like the boring stuff, right? Like, what you want with AI is when you call the insurer, you can tell it some information so it can pre-populate those kinds of lists so that it gives more time for you to talk to the person who is at the call center rather than the person at the call center going, "Oh, where do you live? I mean, how do you spell
Mm.
Richmond? I mean, is it with a Y or with a D? I mean, like, that sort of thing." Yeah.
With the time left we've got, I can't believe it's almost now. That flew. I just want to get your reflections on what does the short term reflection on what the outlook looks like for the government heading into this next election cycle. In that, what do they need to be cognizant of? Like, it's August, there's probably going to be a poll in. I guess people are sort of guessing that it'll be in May or after the next budget. I just want to get your thoughts on what would the government need to be mindful of in setting themselves up to have some sort of electoral success at the next federal poll.
I think that there's a lot that needs to be done. Sorry. I think there. I think the economic environment for them going forward is challenging. I mean, I think the big question that we spend a lot of this conversation about on interest rates, I think, is a big factor there. And I think the effect of, like, the inflationary environment is something that they should be worried about. I think that there's a risk, and I hope, and maybe this is the naive hope, there's a risk that you can kind of get caught up in trying to do a race to the kind of bottom on, like, the knick-knack stuff that sort of feels like you're trying to do something about the cost of living, but not actually dealing with, like, the components of it. You know what I mean? So, there's a tendency to, like, like, I think there's a lot of question around the kind of forced separation of, like, different, the forced divestment kind of policy that kind of, the coalition sort of proposed on, like, on supermarkets, right? Which won't actually have an effect on, like, the cost of living. It just sort of feels like it's in the right areas, And I
Yeah.
think what I worry about is that, people will start to sort of get into that kind of race about trying to do those things. I think, I'm all for doing populist stuff. You know what I mean? Don't get me wrong, like, because I don't think it's populist stuff. I think it's actually doing stuff that helps people. But I think do stuff that helps people, right? You know what I mean? So, focusing on the kind of components of inflation to kind of think about those sort of the future. I think, I mean, some of the decisions might actually not be super hard decisions. Delaying some spending would be actually really helpful, right? You know what I mean? Delaying some spending when actually, there is, if you collect all of the amount of public commitments that have been made by all of the governments, so not just the federal government, but all of the state governments, who are labor, mainly the big ones are the Labor governments. If actually all of them collectively decided to just push off some spending a year, right, which isn't a super difficult decision, that would actually help in this kind of discussion around interest rates, right? Like, I think one thing that's important to think about is don't push it off because like, push it off because actually we've never spent that much. Like, if you take all of the commitments put together, that was the point I was trying to make. With all the commitments put together, it is more than has ever been spent by all of the governments put together. Do you see what I mean? Like, as in, there's a lot of,
Yeah.
you could just push it off because there's not enough capacity to do those. So what are the things that need to be taken into account is that I think that so I think there's an international component to it. I think there's a domestic component in terms of the domestic economy. I also think that there's probably some big challenges that are coming in, like, specific markets because of, businesses not being able to adopt this kind of change in kind of consumer demand. So the supply side of the economy will be impacted a lot because people have not picked up on the changes on the consumer side. But I think the main thing is, really to think about where are all of these pressures hitting, and they're hitting in the middle rings of cities. And so to me, that's the key kind of economic and kind of political challenge for the government, going forward.
What do you mean by the middle ring? Just unpack that for a minute, because that's interesting.
I think that I think a lot of these pressures are basically being faced in where you've got families that are, professional families, professional and or dual income kind of families, which have, reasonable mortgages. Reasonable mortgages. Sometimes a kind of migrant family. Typically would be in areas that have reasonably strong kind of migrant things that keep hold of things that are not typically associated with, say, not typically associated with, say, the with, like, say, centrist kind of politics. So for example, like, private health insurance is a big feature of those kinds of things. Like, I think one of the things people forget about is that 15 million Australians hold private health insurance, right? And in fact, a lot of the private health insurance bodies are actually just a function of, like, big workforces of the past. Like, NIB literally stands for Newcastle builders and steel workers, right? GmbHA is actually just like the Geelong kind of Geelong, like, healthcare workers, right? HCF stands for Healthcare Workers Fund, right? Like, it's there are actually like 15 million people that have that. And so I think that's kind of an important factor. So my point about the middle ring is, like, you think about places like Parramatta, you think about, like, Parramatta, Bankstown, like that middle, like what people call the central city in Sydney. So not as far west as Penrith, but, like, the city, like Ryde, Parramatta, Canterbury, Bankstown. And Melbourne, it's like the southeastern suburbs, right? The ring around, like, to me, that southeastern suburbs and the inner west of Melbourne, right? I think that to me, that's the kind of where the kind of pressure zone is, because in many ways, the nature of, like, the changes that are happening in the economy will affect those parts of the economy in a more aggressive fashion than other places. One other thing about that middle ring to really remember is that actually a lot of those places have reasonably highly educated women in those kind of in those areas, right? But they are highly educated women with not enough hours of work, so actually don't get enough income, right? And so one of the problems that we've got is that we have done really well, in general, to think about the different solutions in terms of gender pay gap and what we might do. And in fact, this government has actually done an extraordinary amount of work on addressing the gender pay gap. Like, just if you made a list of it, it would be an entire thing. But I think what is really significant and what is really important is that actually we're missing out on highly educated women that don't get enough hours of work because they're either returning to work or because the nature of the system. And those people generally tend to work in education and training, generally tend to work in healthcare, and that's actually where that pressure kind of exists.
I guess that point you were making earlier about creating an economy that's far more efficient as well, and we're being inefficient in terms of how we're dealing with 51% of the workforce.
So like over the last 10 years, people that work in education and training have basically seen, there's only been like a 3-point improvement in that. But the people that work in like high income things have had like basically double that.
Yeah, there you go. Amit Singh, thank you so much for your time on the show today. That's our hour. We had so much more to talk about, but we're going to have to obviously get you back on the show before the next federal poll. But we do appreciate your insights. As I said at the opening, you're one of the great minds of our movement. We need more people like you in our party in our broader movement to help us fix some of the problems that are impacting everyday Australians. So we really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks heaps. Thanks a lot for this.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.